Welcome to Caped Conversations, Ohio University's Center for Applied and Professional Ethics podcast series. I'm Christoph Hanisch, an Associate Philosophy Professor at OU and the Director of CAPE. My co-host is James Petrick, who is a Philosophy Professor and the Center's Assistant Director. Our Center's mission is to advance practical, ethical and moral understanding, judgment and decision-making. On Caped Conversations, we talk to experts in ethics, moral psychology, and moral philosophy. We will discuss how and why current contemporary debates matter, not just in academic circles but in everyday life, especially as society and technology keep changing. We thank Ohio University, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Department of Philosophy, and the Scripps School of Journalism for their support. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. And thank you for tuning in. Welcome to a new episode of Caped Conversations, the podcast series of Ohio University's Center for Applied and Professional Ethics. My name is Christoph Hanisch, and I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy and the current Director of the Center. With me today in the podcast studio are my co-hosts, Professor of Philosophy James Petrick, and Jack Elmore, one of our recent graduates and incoming MA students, and Gretchen Sars, who's also one of our recent philosophy students. And I'm very happy to introduce today's guest, Professor Benjamin Elmore, who is currently a visiting professor of philosophy at Ohio University. Welcome, Ben. It is great to have you on the show.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Ben, before we get started, let me briefly introduce a couple of highlights of your already impressive scholarly biography. I say already because, different from the person currently speaking, Ben is a young philosopher at the very beginning of a promising career, and still his portfolio already comprises a number of very important publications in ethics and moral and political philosophy. I also mentioned this remark on Dr. Elmore's career stage because it was in the fall of 2016 that Ben and I met for the first time when I started my job at Ohio University. And Ben was one of my first graduate students in the metaethics seminar in the fall of 2016. And metaethics is, by the way, also a course that Jack took almost 10 years later. So just this kind of personal connection here with other people in the room. But back to the more formal introduction. So after an undergraduate program in religion at Berea College and the MA in philosophy at OU, Dr. Elmore pursued his PhD at Purdue University. His doctoral dissertation is entitled Scanlonian Contractualism and Animals, a topic that will also figure prominently in today's podcast episode. I think it is fair to say, Ben, that the moral philosophical questions of the moral standing of animals are currently one of your main research areas and a kind of theme
Definitely.
You've worked a lot in the past couple of years and are currently working on.
Yes.
So Ben has published some of his work in the Journal of Animal Ethics, in Theoria, in Ethics and the Environment, and in the peer-reviewed journal Between the Species. Dr. Elmore is currently also working on a book project under contract with Routledge, expanding on his work on the contractualist tradition in moral philosophy and its relevance for questions of animal ethics. When is that book about to come out, if I may ask?
I'm supposed to submit my manuscript at the end of this year.
Okay, well.
So that's my summer project.
Well, good luck, and we all look very much forward to studying that publication. So thank you, Ben, for being here, and we all look very much forward to our conversation today.
Sounds good. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Ben. We have, I think I told you, a bit of a tradition here where we start with a less academic question, and it is, if there were a fantasy philosophy league, you've heard of fantasy football, I'm sure. If there were a fantasy philosophy league, whom would be your first selection if you had the first choice? And before you answer, I just have to warn Christoph and Jack and Gretchen that we're going to do it a little differently today, that I'm giving Ben the first choice, Christoph the second choice, Jack the third choice, Gretchen the fourth choice, and I'll take the last choice because I've already heard your first choices last week. So I want to vary it a little bit here. No need for long explanations. Just say a name that pops into your head. But Ben, your first pick in the draft.
Tough choice, but I would say John Stuart Mill. Very powerful, creative, liberal mind. I've always found his work in On Liberty to be personally inspiring. And as I've taught natural law theory and other things, Mill's writings have been important in my own thought.
Solid choice. And he is, to extend maybe the sports football metaphor, a big believer in competition in training camp, right? That he always thought the best antidote to bad speech is more and better speech, not eliminating the bad speech.
Definitely.
So he wants that competition of ideas. Okay, John Stuart Mill. Christoph.
Well, it still is Kant, I guess, simply because, the influence in both theoretical and practical philosophy, I think, is difficult to deny. And even though I'm not in agreement with all that Kant has said or did say, it's fair to say that he continues to be also, for my personal interests, very influential and an important source of philosophical ideas up to this day.
Nice, nice. All right. So now we'll go to our executive producer, Jack.
All right. If you're watching this on the video, please excuse me and Gretchen sharing the mic because there was a bit of technical issue. Anyways, for the third pick, I'm lucky to still select Plato. There's just too much that I said in the last video. He's responsible for a lot of Western philosophy up to this point. I will be selecting Plato.
Nice.
I would still have to go with Aristotle.
Plato versus Aristotle.
I know, a little duel there, but I still also think of Aristotle as, I guess I would consider him a founding figure almost in philosophy, and I think his ability to challenge ideas and work through them, I think that would be pretty formidable in a fantasy football league. So
Gotcha.
So, yes.
Well, my plan of getting different selections by having us pick progressively totally backfired because everybody got to pick exactly the same person as last time. This time I'll change it up a little bit with the fifth pick, and I'm going to go with Leibniz. I mean, to have made major contributions in philosophy and mathematics, I'll take Leibniz as my fifth pick in the fantasy philosophy draft. Okay, enough of that nonsense. Now on to the philosophy part of our podcast here, Ben. So as Christoph mentioned, you do a lot of research and writing on the topic of the moral standing of non-human animals. And I would like to begin by just asking how you got interested in that area and how your views evolved in that area, and maybe a snapshot at the end of your current position regarding the moral standing of non-human animals.
Okay, so how I got interested, I guess, is personal experience. So in 2013, my mother got a dog named Gracie, and I was around her a lot and got to appreciate up close just the sophisticated capacities, intellectual, but also in terms of emotional capacities that non-human animals really do have if we pay close attention. So this last semester, I taught for the first time a paper by a feminist critical theorist named Josephine Donovan, and she talks about the importance of personal experience in coming to see that animals matter. And she talks about this notion of attentive love, of looking attentively, lovingly, caringly at the interests of animals in personal experience in a way that goes beyond, dry arguments and things like that. And it's important for her that through this kind of experience, we gain a kind of moral perception. And that was the first time I taught that paper and even read it. but it seemed to me to give a good explanation of how I came to appreciate animals to start with. Just encountering what she calls the universal grammar that she takes from Max Scheller's phenomenology, that non-human animals, they behave in ways that we can understand. They express inner mental states through their behavior. And if we pay attention to that, we can kind of commune with them. So that's an explanation of, I guess, my moral psychology and why I came to care about animals. But also, in the midst of that, I started thinking things that I found out later Peter Singer thought about, like, well, do we really need to eat meat to be healthy? And no, that the majority view in animal ethics is we don't need animal products. So the justification of doing that seems to be based on a preference for the taste. So that's one of Singer's central claims. And I thought about that before I read it in Singer, so I was pleased to see that he said it too. And I guess moving on to the question about my view of the moral standing of non-human animals, I'm also influenced by Singer, not by his utilitarianism. So I'm more of a deontological thinker myself. I think there are things that we just owe to individuals, and there are constraints. You know, we shouldn't sacrifice the individual for the greater good or something like that. So that's a difference from Singer. But where I'm inspired by Singer is what's called sentientism. He thinks that all sentient beings matter morally. And he motivates this view. So he motivates it by considering other thinkers that are important, people like Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, and people who say, non-human animals don't matter in the way we're concerned with. For example, Rawls, in talking about justice, thinks we owe justice to those with a sense of justice and a conception of the good life. They can reciprocate. Well, okay, Singer says, let's think about that. We owe justice to those with a sense of justice. Well, does that really get us the result that we owe justice to all human beings? When you think about it, no. There are many many human beings who actually can't think about principles of justice. They can't think about the duties that they owe other people. Well, those are people that in older language are included in the argument from marginal cases. This is also called the argument from species overlap and other things like that, the argument from consistency. Well, if you think about it, these properties that people like Rawls and Kant are concerned with, moral personhood, a kind of self-awareness, you can be a reciprocal legislator of universal law. If that's your criteria of who matters, many human beings don't matter, straightforwardly. And so you have to do some kind of gymnastics to still say they matter. So in the case of going back to a sense of justice for Rawls, who doesn't have a sense of justice? Well, infants, young children. We might say, well, they'll eventually develop a sense of justice. Well, maybe if they don't get brain damage. But what about those who are born permanently disabled? They'll never develop those, as I call them, highfalutin capacities. So straightforwardly, the account gets us the result, well, we don't owe justice, or for Kant, we don't owe moral duties to these kinds of beings. Well, if that's what we try to make as the grounds of moral standing, owing duties to them, and it gives us the wrong result. The thing is, though, we really do know that all human beings matter morally. We owe them duties. That's what moral standing means. We owe them duties directly. If we do something to them that's cruel, etc., it's not just that we've behaved in an objectionable way, it's we violated something we owe them. So, these kinds of capacities, like a sense of justice, moral rationality, a high level of intelligence, these are the kinds of capacities that these thinkers take to be the grounds of moral standing, and that's why they typically think non-human animals don't matter morally, or in Rawls's case, he didn't say they didn't matter morally, but we don't owe them justice. Well, those capacities rule out non-human animals, and that's typically the result they want. But they also rule out human beings. So those capacities are no good. They shouldn't be the grounds of moral standing. Yeah. So that's Singer's view, that the argument for marginal cases works, but that's not his whole view. So going on, how can we come up with a theory that says, well, actually, all human beings matter morally, but so do non-human animals, many of them at least? His view is sentience. And it's not just like we're coming up with the capacity that fits the cases. Singer thinks sentience is a uniquely principled capacity. So it's not just like we have a prior intuition and we want to prop it up. He says this. Well, let's talk about having interests. He wants to say the principle of equal consideration of interests is the only principle of equality that makes any sense. So if we want to say human beings are equal, we all think that. Humans are equal. That's a modern liberal contribution that we all typically think. Human beings are morally equal. How can they be morally equal? Well, if it's based, remember, on intelligence, a sense of justice, then it turns out to be a fiction. It turns out to not get us the right result. Well, Singer suggests there can be a kind of equality if we say equality in consideration. We should give everybody the same consideration. The same interests should be treated the same. So if you suffer a certain amount, have a certain amount of pain, then that amount of pain is equal to the same amount of pain for anybody else, even if it's a chimpanzee. Well, how do you fall under the protection of the principle of equal consideration of interests? This is where sentientism comes in. So, Singer asks, let's try to come up with a non-arbitrary cutoff. What would be a non-arbitrary cutoff? To say you have interests. Well, what is necessary to have interests, according to Singer? That you can experience pain and pleasure, you can suffer and enjoy. And he gives an example to illustrate this point. Consider the case of a rock. You're walking down the road and you kick a stone. Does it really make sense to say it wasn't in the interest of the stone to be kicked? It doesn't make sense, he says. Change the case. You're walking down the road and you kick a mouse. Well, can we really say it's not in the interest of the mouse to get kicked? Yes, because it suffers when we kick it. So for Singer, it only makes sense to say you have interests if you can suffer and enjoy. So that's kind of the bedrock, the bare minimum. But can we go above the minimum? Can we make it higher? Well, he says if we try to do that, what are we going to appeal to? These kinds of capacities like intelligence, rationality, a sense of justice that actually people don't have equally. So no, we can't go higher. We can always ask why. That rules out a lot of other cases. So sentience. Can't go higher than sentience. Can't go lower than sentience. Well, if that's the case, then the principle of equal consideration of interests applies to all sentient creatures. All sentient creatures have moral standing, and there can be no justification for not taking those interests into account. And the way I kind of describe this when I teach Singer is Singer thinks that the principle of equal consideration of interests is the only principle that is not a fairy tale principle of human equality. But if that's true, if it's the only non-arbitrary principle, it also applies to animals, at least those who are sentient, excluding, say, bivalves and things like that. All right. So I'm influenced by that. I think that strikes me as basically right, that kind of view.
Okay, good. Thanks for the overview. I don't know, Christoph, did you want to take a first run at a question?
Yeah, I think maybe we should mention that we also studied a paper in preparation for today's conversation, a recent publication by Ben, a defense of the argument from marginal cases. Parts of the argument you already kind of nicely summarized today. And I think one theme that is very central in that paper, but seems to be relevant for the entire discussion in the philosophical literature on animal ethics, is that contrast between moral standing and moral status. I think you already mentioned that contrast a little bit. And well, first of all, I was wondering if you could say for our listeners a little bit more about the basic contrast between these two notions and why they are so central for the debate. And then, depending on what we do with that contrast, I might have one or the other follow-up question concerning that contrast. But to get us started, I think you mentioned at one point in the paper that moral standing is a kind of all or nothing category or concept that means it's a property, a feature that an individual has or does not have. And is it fair to say that you agree with the claim that moral status, on the other hand, is something that comes in degrees? So just as a first question concerning that contrast.
So I take the notion of moral status from Shelley Kagan, and when he talks about that, he includes a few different things under the term. He says basically moral status is the normative profile a being has. It includes the duties we have to that being, so what do we owe that being? But for him, it also includes the relative weight of their interests. So he disagrees with Singer. He thinks actually the same amount of pleasure and pain may not count the same. So if a being has higher status for Kagan, then its interests matter more. Now, when I use the term, I kind of clarify here that I don't mean it in exactly the same way Kagan means it. So I'm not talking about the relative weight of interests. I'm just talking about the first half of that, the duties we owe to others. Which duties do we owe to them? How do we satisfy their interests? And I don't know if I put it in the paper, but when I'm working on this in more detail in my book manuscript, I say also what I mean by status is what Course Guard means by the content of our moral duties. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think connected with that contrast, I was wondering what you think about the following proposal, a proposal that kind of tries to reconcile the three authors that you criticize in your paper with your own view.
Yeah.
And that reconciliation would kind of be based on that contrast between moral standing versus moral status. So, as we already said, I think it's correct to say that moral standing is this all or nothing concept, whereas moral status seems to come in degrees along a spectrum of having more or less of it. And so I'm wondering if maybe in cases in which we choose or have to choose between the welfare of a non-human and a human animal, the status arguments, Korsgaard, Nussbaum, Kagan, might tip the balance in favor of the human animals. And I tried to come up with a thought experiment. Sorry, it's another version of the infamous trolley problem, and I might that might help us trigger some intuitions regarding that proposal. That maybe moral standing is one thing, but the moral status stuff might play a role in different parts of the argument concerning animal welfare. So I call it the splitting trolley scenario, because I let the trolley split in order to bracket all the standard considerations regarding acts and omissions that are standardly coming with trolley cases. So in the splitting trolley case, you again have a runaway trolley, right? And you have these two tracks after the switch. And The situation is the following. If you don't throw the switch in that scenario, the trolley is going to hit the switch and is splitting into two parts.
Split in two.
And is killing anything that is along the two separate tracks.
You have two projectiles.
Right? Yeah, two projectiles, exactly. Yeah, so we split into two halves, both of which will kill what is in its paths, in the two separate paths. So, and there are two scenarios, right? In the first scenario, we have a sentient animal on one of the tracks and no creature at all on the other. And I think it is clearly the case that in that case, we don't just flip a coin in order to decide what to do and whether to throw the switch into the left direction or the right direction. So we redirect the trolley to the empty track, and this seems to clearly show that most of us, even those who are skeptical about the moral standing of animals, do award some moral standing to the animal, right? Because we redirect it to the empty track. And so that also seems to imply that we attribute some moral status to the animal. Seems to follow as well, right? Because if it has moral standing, it has to be at least somewhere on the spectrum of moral status. It sounds
a qualification here, as long as you don't take a Kantian indirect duty view, where you don't do it because it'll corrupt your character or something. On that view, the animal doesn't have moral standing, actually.
Okay, but I thought the intuition that I want to trigger is that in the case of the empty track versus the sentient animal, people would say, no, you're blameworthy if you direct it to the animal only, right? Yeah. So, but again, we can maybe bracket that stuff about the status in that case. But then, second scenario, we have the sentient animal on one track and the cognitively disabled human being on the other. Yeah. And in that case, do we flip a coin? It sounds to me that most of us would think, well, we probably don't do that, right? We direct it towards the animal in that case that's important, without denying that the animal has moral standing. Right? Because in conjunction with the first case, that's, I think, what follows. So it seems that we don't have to deny the animal's moral standing and nevertheless direct the trolley towards it. And maybe that is where the status stuff becomes a relevant set of arguments and saying, well, it's kind of maybe all that stuff about the potential personhood in the case of Kagan.
You're right, Kagan would say that.
The status then makes a difference in these hard choices where we have to choose. Yeah.
Kagan would say, look, the severely disabled human being, they have something else. They have this modal personhood, a metaphysical property that means their interests count more, even if they're otherwise similar. So the morally right thing to do is to save them instead.
Now, I have to say, one thing I liked about all three of their views, and I have some sympathy. Well, I don't know if this is Christoph's view, but in the trolley case, and by the way, I think I misunderstood. What was the nature of the splitting? Is that if you don't do anything, the trolley's going to split? Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
So
now I understand.
That act, omissions, intuitions messing with the case.
Okay, that makes sense. But my intuition is it's not a tie. It's not a coin toss. Even if we bracket all the sorts of things you were talking about, it's not a tie. It's not a coin toss. And what attractive feature. And to me, that's a pretty deep moral intuition. Yeah. And one way I think to look at all three of the thinkers you're talking about in the essay, Nussbaum, Kagan, and Korsgaard, is that their views, I think, do justice to that intuition in one way or another. Would you buy that as a characterization of their views? Would they all do justice to that intuition? Because there's significance, I think, to all of them. I mean, in Kagan, it's in the form of this modal personhood. Well, I think, so it's a little different, but I think they all would be sympathetic to my contention that it's not just a coin toss, even in that case we're talking about.
Now, I think Kagan's is the easiest one to guess what he would say. For Nussbaum and Korsgaard, I'm not exactly sure what they would say. But thinking especially about Korsgaard, she's a committed Kantian, Would she even permit us to flip the lever? I don't know. After all, you would, in a way, seem to be treating a sentient being merely as a means. And in her fellow creatures, she thinks all sentient beings are ends in themselves. So would she say, flip the trolley, flip the switch? I don't know what she would say there. I'm not exactly sure what Nussbaum would say either. I could only guess. Yeah.
I guess with Nussbaum, my sense is that for her, species membership is very important, and
It's
the fact that you have
in terms of the status, right?
An injury that would prevent the full development of the capacities that are natural to the species doesn't undermine the significance of the presence of those capacities in virtue of species membership. So I took her view to be that that's a significant factor that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, her view is that, look, human beings, they're different than a lot of these animals that we compare them with in animal ethics, in the sense that they need to live in a human community to have their interests satisfied. So in that sense, I take her to have a view about the status of animals, in that we have different duties. We have duties of care to human beings who are severely disabled that we may not have to a non-human animal because they're relatively autonomous. So yeah, she thinks the political context matters, but that specific example, though, that goes beyond that kind of consideration. It's just a hard case.
But would you then deny or reject that proposal of combining the two, like saying taking a certain sentientist view regarding the notion of moral standing and adding moral status consideration in case of these choices that I tried to illustrate with the trolley case? Would you say that, well, you deny also the status hierarchy? As a kind of philosophically reasonable set of arguments in the hands of Korsgaard, Kagan, and Nussbaum.
To be clear, both Nussbaum and Korsgaard, they reject the full-blooded notion of status that Kagan talks about, where the interests of persons just matter more. They don't have that view. For Korsgaard, when we ask what matters, we have to ask to who. So her theory is all value is tethered to the individual perspective. So remember when I said I'm talking about status here in the sense that's the same as Korsgaard's notion of what are the specific duties we owe. So it might be a little misleading that I use Kagan's notion because he means two things, the specific duties and the relative weight of the interests.
Because Korsgaard, I think, would clearly think as a Kantian that we have a richer set of duties towards the members of the human.
Yeah, there certainly would be the
community.
Legislators of universal law, things like that. But she does think non-human animals are ends in themselves because they experience the world as valenced, as good or bad for themselves, as sentient beings, and they pursue their functional unity. So they try to avoid pain because it destroys them. And they pursue that as their final good, as their ends of action. That's her account of why animals matter. And she,
guided the ends and the means to accomplish those ends are determined by instinct in the case of animals, if I remember correctly.
Right.
Whereas humans are special, of course, because we have that second order autonomy that allows us to transcend what nature and instinct would otherwise dictate.
Her view is that those are separate sources of ends in themselves. So there are two kinds of beings that are ends in themselves, Kantian rational agents and non-human animals. She thinks there are both,
So both have moral standing, but
they do.
I think she would respond and say, no, we have to throw the switch because of the status distinction between the animals as ends in themselves versus the human animals as
She
different
might
kinds of ends.
she
in
might say we
themselves,
have
yeah.
different duties in that case. Yeah,
Just wondering.
I'm not sure.
Good. Thank you.
So I'm a little interested in the kind of social application, I guess, of like your argument, especially with the argument marginal cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious if you think that accepting the argument marginal cases commits a person to maybe veganism or just to the unnecessary suffering of animals, or perhaps neither. But if it, commits a person.
Yeah, so I guess in this paper, it's just the deep question of who matters morally. So, in terms of the practical applications, that would have to go beyond this paper. And we would have to consider okay, do we really respect the moral standing of a creature with certain practices? Right. So, if you just want to know my views on various practices, sure. So, factory farming, I could go through that. So Singer talks about this, and even Roger Scruton, who himself is a political conservative, thinks factory farming's bad. I can combine their answers here. Why is factory farming bad? Well, modern industrialized agriculture, what does it do? It corrals animals closely together and causes them to suffer, causes them to put on a lot of weight very quickly, unnaturally, that can give them bone diseases and cause other kinds of diseases. And for, say, hens, it pushes them down so they can't even stand up in a kind of litter that is filthy, like with kinds of stuff in feces and urine that causes blisters. So if they try to stand up, their legs hurt, but if they lay down, they get blisters. Animals are given antibiotics to grow quickly, things like that. It produces antibiotic-resistant bacteria that harms us. And all these different kinds of things, for example, pigs and other creatures have their tails docked, castrated, steer are dehorned, castrated, things like that. And all their lives, they're corralled together very tightly, where they jostle one another. They never see the light of day until it's, transport. And when it comes to the slaughter, it's often not painless. So, for example, chickens, when they're sent on the belt upside down by their claws, what they try to do is stun them before they are boiled to have their feathers come off. But oftentimes the stunning doesn't work, so they're boiled alive before they're cut. So, or, afterwards. So a lot of this is immense suffering.
Yeah, I was going to say that kind of sounds more like the unnecessary suffering, because I was wondering then when you think of the farm-raised animals and animals that are treated well before they are eventually killed and whatnot, that seems much different, even though you are ultimately killing the animal, much different than this factory farming where it is in some may see it like unnecessary suffering, usually from at least what I know, those conditions are usually due to cost and how to make the most profits and take the least amount of resources and money into animals. So it does seem a little bit, like the unnecessary suffering there is.
It's a lot of suffering, and you're right that the difference between that and say a more traditional agriculture, it is a vast difference in terms of suffering. For example, Roger Scruton argues against factory farming, but for more traditional farming. And he thinks it's because, in part, more traditional farming actually brings the animals to exist to start with. So without that industry, he argues, then they wouldn't even have any life or any welfare and a somewhat pleasant life. So there is a deeper kind of objection, though. So if we think about Nussbaum or Korsgaard, what would they say? Even Singer, he's suspicious that even the more humane farming doesn't satisfy the principle of equal consideration of interest. So why do we do it? Why do we end up killing the animal for our taste? Is our taste something that really is more significant than that animal going on living? Singer doubts that, and he's a utilitarian. So he's not going to be as stringent. So for Course Guard, the deeper explanation would be like something like this. It's still mere means treatment of a being who is an end in themselves. And that would be my view. That any sentient creature, they can suffer and enjoy. They have a point of view of the universe, of the world, and they have preferences to go on doing what they enjoy. In my view, that is sufficient for being an end in oneself. And so, for something that's an end in themselves, I shouldn't just go out and make them a prop for my projects, for my goals. Why should I? As if they're there for me. That's my view. Yeah.
And then I have one more follow-up question, and I hope it doesn't stray too much from the paper topic, but I'm curious. I've learned about Native American culture and how then they would kill an animal, typically thank it for providing them with energy and food. This is a necessary kill for survival. And then they would go on, what's always stuck with me is use every single part of the animal, use the fur for clothes and whatnot. And they thought that as far as I understand, respectful towards the animal, to use every part of the animal, the bones for any supplies and whatnot. And I'm wondering if that maybe shows a different, I guess, more like consideration of the moral status of the animal, taking that time to thank the animal and the treatment in that way.
So something like that, it tells us something about the person, about their character, that they are looking at the animal in a way that's a lot different than we commonly look at animals. So yeah, that it's in a sense praiseworthy that you have a greater reverence for the animal. It's not just a machine to convert into a product. That's a difference. Sure, it's a morally relevant difference for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
So my question centers around like more the intention behind establishing a moral standing on animals or just any being in general. Is there more of a worry, or which one do you think establishes more worry? Is there more of a worry with being too broad with your ethics, or too broad with which beings you give moral standing, or is there more of a worry on being too narrow, excluding too many beings, in your opinion?
So here's something to think about. Would you rather fail to treat a creature as having moral standing that really does? Or would you rather treat something as having moral standing when it doesn't? Which one is the worst failure, morally speaking? It seems like the former. I really did owe duties of justice and morality to this creature, and I treated it merely as a means. That seems to me like a more catastrophic failure for sure. Yeah, and for Singer, the way it goes is something like this. I always bring him up, even though I'm not a utilitarian. His view is that the history of moral progress has been an ever-expanding circle of moral concern, and especially equality, equal concern. So back in the old days and ancient Near Eastern texts and things like that in the ancient world, there's a lot of tribalism where it's my in-group. We're the ones who matter. And then over time, other groups matter. Maybe there's some notion of international justice or something like that. And maybe somebody else matters outside of my own religion and race and gender, things like that, profession. He thinks that's the history of moral progress, ever extending the circle of who is equal, who matters equally. In his view, and my view as well, is the next step is recognizing non-human animals matter too. Yeah.
And then just one more follow-up in a different vein, but I think somewhere in the paper I was thinking about the question, what matters more to, again, establishing an ethics on animals and animal moral status? Is it more important that they're more similar to people, or is it more important that I don't think you have a positive answer on that one, but or is it more important that there's a sort of higher utility of these animals in connection with people? Because I had a recent discussion on why certain animals were treated or were domesticated, or were they seen more as food, and an answer I got was that it's mainly determined by how they've been utilized by humans, and their utility or their status of utility to humans throughout history. So do you have an opinion on whether or not similarity or utility is more important?
I would say neither
Okay.
is fundamentally morally important.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second consideration, utility to humans, no doubt explains why we domesticated animals to start with, but it doesn't strike me as morally fundamental. So let's talk about similarity to humans. I don't think that's directly relevant. Now, similarity to humans allows us to better understand animals. So this kind of, universal grammar where, hey, when I'm in pain, I cry or move away from the painful thing. I can see that in animals too. So it serves a kind of epistemic role. So I can understand the mental state, the experience you have because of similarity to me. But if we want to say similarity is metaphysically necessary for moral standing, that goes into what Nussbaum calls, say, the so like us approach or something like that. I don't think that matters fundamentally.
Yeah, I have a couple quick sort of follow-up questions on you were talking about the notion of an end in itself.
Yeah.
And this, of course, famously goes to Kant.
Yeah.
The idea of persons are ends in themselves, and they have worth and not mere market value, and so we cannot treat them merely as means.
Yeah.
And of course, the word merely is important there, and you inserted it very nicely, talking about mere means. As I understand that with Kant in connection with persons, what constitutes a case of treating a person as a mere means is that there's a failure to respect the person's autonomy.
Right.
But you want to, I think, follow Korsgaard in extending the notion of being an end in itself to non-human animals.
Yeah.
And non-human animals would arguably not have autonomy.
Not in the same sense.
Right. So that kind of leads to my question here. If that's the case, how do we recognize what it is to treat a non-human animal or a non-person, I'll put it that way, as a mere means, if we don't have autonomy as the key factor? Or perhaps we do.
Yeah. So non-human animals do have interests that are their own, that matter to them. So I guess kind of a criticism of Singer is he thinks sentience is necessary for having interests. Well, interests that matter to you. So suffering and enjoyment, that matters to you. And animals have preferences about that. So there is a kind of autonomy. So I said not the same kind of autonomy, but I did bring up Tom Reagan's notion of preference autonomy.
Right.
So non-human animals do have goals that they pursue. They have goods that they pursue. So it's not as stark as Kant makes it out to be, that you either have his kind of autonomy or none at all. It's a false dichotomy, I think. And there is something special about that, having interest, having goods that matter to you. And it matters that you don't suffer. It matters that non-human animals can enjoy relations, interspecies relations and intraspecies relations, and just having a pleasant life, going on doing what you do. Yeah, that strikes me as sufficing for being an end in oneself. So this kind of creature who goes about enjoying their life, pursuing various goods, my intuition here is, what right do I have to take them up and make them mine to do whatever I wish that I want to do with them? It strikes me as treating a being who is an end in themselves as a mere means, and it shouldn't be done.
Yeah, let me jump in there quickly, too, because for Kant, at any rate, the mere is important.
Yeah.
Partly because he does recognize legitimate cases in which persons use one another. And the legitimate cases are cases in which there isn't a failure to respect the other's autonomy. So it might be a kind of contractual relationship where I hire somebody to build the deck, or I agree to build the deck for somebody for a certain price. And I'm wondering if, in the case of non-human sentient creatures, whether there is a similar permissible use. Does the idea of preference autonomy allow for that sort of possibility?
Sure. So when you take a dog into your family, like in my case, you have a common life together, and your preferences kind of shape one another's preferences, and you enjoy being with one another. I benefit from the dog, but the dog benefits from me and enjoys that benefit. So there is a kind of thing that parallels Kant's case. Yeah. Even if the non-human animal can't, think about the formula of universal law or something like that, it's something I kind of indicate towards the end of this paper is humans don't really either.
Just to sort of put this in very stark terms, and I like that explanation very much. So I'm thinking of moving.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really, but
sure.
Hypothetically, say I'm thinking of moving. And should I weight the impact on my cat as heavily as I would weight the impact on dependent children or a spouse in coming to it? I mean, it obviously would be nonsense to say I consult with the cat or reach a joint agreement as I would with my spouse, for instance. But should I try and estimate the impact that the move would have on my cat or a dog, whatever the case might be, in terms of their preferences in making that move? Or in that case, does prioritizing my and the other person's preferences in this case make sense?
So when there is anything relevant to the animal having a preference, it should matter. But I think in most cases, it's not going to matter because the animal is not going to have a preference either way. But here's an example where it could matter.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but set that aside.
Yeah.
I could see some environments being very superior for if I'm currently living on a sheep farm and I have a border collie.
Sure.
It seems to me it would matter significantly to the border collie's preference if I decide to move to a condo in Miami.
That's a good example, sure. And I think that should matter significantly, sure. I was going to give a case, for example, of my mother's dog. So right now, what if she got a chance to move? Well, right now, my mother's dog has had surgery, and so we have to change the bandage every day. So actually moving would be distressing, so we shouldn't. Now, your case of the border collie is a good one. Well, the non-human animal's preference should matter significantly if you take them seriously, as you should. But we should also take into consideration that non-human animals, I think Mill was right in a way that they need less to live a life that's satisfying to them. Mm-hmm. So that matters.
Yeah. Okay, good.
And I think, for Korsgaard's version of Kant, isn't it the case, Ben, that she also takes a significant Aristotelian turn to make sense of that version of autonomy that applies to at least higher order animals? And I think she's arguing basically that the animal's form, teleologically understood, kind of determines the instincts that the basis for the animal's action, and as long as the animal is able to instantiate that form, it acts autonomously. But it's a kind of it's a notion that's connected to that idea of a teleological organization of the animal's form.
Both Nussbaum and Korsgaard are heavily Aristotelian in that sense. There seems to be something like this essence of this creature. That's kind of a view that I'm not totally sold on. I'm more inspired by James Rachel's book, created from animals, the moral implications of Darwinism,
Mm-hmm.
is a strongly Aristotelian ethic. Is it really plausible given evolutionary theory? Is it really like that? That there are these strong essences of each species, or is it more a matter of a variation among populations that vary, and there's not really this strong essence? So that is something that I'm thinking through more in the book version of this discussion. That maybe they're too Aristotelian.
But I think what Korsgaard basically tries to do in those discussions is to reconcile the idea that there is still something unique about that, so to speak, double-layered structure of autonomy that only applies to humans as ends in themselves. But there is a notion of autonomy that is interestingly brought up in Korsgaard's argument that tries to so to speak, apply the notion of autonomy also to the cases of at least higher order mammals or...
Oh, yeah, maybe. But you are right that there is this contrast between humans who are autonomous, reciprocal legislators of universal law, and animals who are driven by instinct. Now, she means by this not that they're like wind-up toys, but the goals that they do have are there because of biology.
And the instincts are laws for them, practical laws.
Yeah.
That's why they are still performing actions, for example.
And Korsgaard has this view here. She really stresses this, that human beings are enormously special and that we can think about reasons for and against our actions, especially moral reasons. And that's what moral agency is for her. And she's aware that some people disagree with that.
Oh, yeah.
That, maybe moral agency involves heavily character traits, like that. For example, a deer expresses kindness and compassion to its offspring or something like that. Maybe that matters for moral agency. Now, it seems to me it's commonly assumed that the Korsgaard style picture is just right. I'm not so sure it is. I think it really is a substantive view that this is what being a moral agent really is. I'm not so sure about that. Maybe there's something to that view that moral agency involves character, and maybe animals can have character. If so, then animals can be moral agents in a robust way.
But at the same time, switching a little bit to the more Humean tradition in thinking about agency, isn't it still the case that, for example, in terms of our praising and blaming practices, we treat fellow human beings very differently from praising and blaming the animals? And that seems to have to do with that second-order autonomy that the Kantians talk about, or Korsgaard at least talks about.
I think you could have a picture that combines both, where you don't solely stress the kind of Kantian second-order rationality. Maybe there is that, but there's also the other. There's also benevolence and compassion and things like that that are important for moral agency. And maybe non-human animals can have that, even if they don't have this other kind of moral agency. So I think there can be both. And the Kantian, like Korsgaard, I don't think she stresses both. It's just the...
But you would agree that in terms of moral responsibility, there is
a difference. So, common distinction in animal ethics, that it's still a contested distinction, but the difference between a moral agent and a moral patient. So the idea that moral agents can think about reasons for and against their actions. A moral patient, say the so-called marginal cases. They matter morally, but they can't do that. That's a common distinction in animal ethics. And some people push back against that distinction, though, and they say that implies the patient's merely passive, but the patient, as they're described, they actually can express their preferences and engage with us in a way that goes beyond that kind of dichotomy. So there is, from some people, Nussbaum included, and there's a book called Zoopolis, Political Theory of Animal Rights, that pushes back against that patient-style view. There's more agency to animals than that.
So maybe even some forms of criminal punishment might at some point
be
fitting
in
response to...
Some people have brought that up. Yeah.
There actually was a period, especially in Europe, where criminal trials of animals
Yeah.
were not uncommon.
And in Plato's Laws, there's this
Yeah.
famous example of a column getting kicked out of the city limits because it crushed.
Oh, is that right?
So the stone column got punished.
I don't remember that example. Yeah, I know there's a case, and I think it's like, I don't know, I want to say 15th century, but I have to track this down, where a hog is convicted of homicide, of infanticide, for killing an infant. So there is that history.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are interesting cases. So thinking about sort of special obligations that you might have to your own species that you wouldn't necessarily have to other species, I guess I'm inclined to think, for instance, that there would be something odd, or at least I would find it odd to think I have a moral obligation to protect some prey in the wild from a predator. I don't necessarily think it would be wrong if somebody decided to do that out of sympathy, but I also think it would be odd to think there's an obligation, because the predator is simply performing its species directed function, and the prey is taking its appropriate evasive action as far as it can, and so on. But I do think I would have a moral obligation to intervene if I could, to protect, say, a jogger from a mountain lion who was poised to attack. And I think there would be a sense in which I was morally negligent if I didn't provide assistance in that case, or if I didn't pull a human being from a water that a shark was closing in on if I could, as opposed to I wouldn't think I had a moral obligation to try and rescue the seal pup. So, and do you think your view allows for that kind of sort of discrimination in terms of obligations to one's own species?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult question, and people disagree over it. Some people do argue that we have a duty to change nature, to intervene and maybe phase out predators, or kind of do some scientific kind of changing of their DNA or something. That's a live view in animal ethics. It's not really a view that I have a strong position on.
That's interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt. That's one I have a strong position on. That would just seem to me, well, anyway, go ahead with your answer.
So one thinker who talks about these kinds of questions, not exactly that example, but predator-prey relations, Tom Reagan famously says, when the wolf kills the sheep, the wolf isn't violating the rights of the sheep, even though the sheep has rights, because the wolf is not a moral agent. So the wolf hasn't done anything morally wrong. Now, that doesn't apply directly to your case, because, hey, the mountain lion who attacks the jogger, they're not doing anything wrong either, because they're not a moral agent violating somebody's rights. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would still be, in intervening, I would be thwarting the mountain lion's preference autonomy and frustrating that interest on behalf of the mountain lion.
Yeah. My view is we live in a bad world. It's not a good thing that predators exist. It's a natural evil, in my view. So the philosophy of religion is a kind of natural evil. God, did you make this?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That's interesting. I did not know that there were people who did advocate for, if we could, eliminating predation from nature, somehow altering natural species to eliminate that, and that I have to, and this could just be my own instinct. I said I have strong feelings on that, but I just think that would be completely unwarranted and an act of incredible hubris. A kind of related example to that I was thinking about, and this I could perhaps come a little bit closer to seeing, is if we had a treatment to cure a severe cognitive disability in a human being. Other things being equal, allocation of medical resources and so on, other things being equal, I think, we have a moral obligation to provide that treatment. Yet if we developed some method by which we could raise the cognitive ability of rabbits to that of human beings, or of dogs to that of a typical human being, I don't think we have any obligation to do that. And in
Yeah.
fact, my intuition is that's probably a bad idea, both for us and the dogs or the rabbits.
Yeah, some people have the intuition that we shouldn't intervene in nature. Maybe nature sets the boundaries of the flourishing of that creature. Somebody we talked about earlier who takes a different view, Shelley Kagan. Hey, it seems right to him and maybe surely some others, that, yeah, we should intervene. We would give that creature a more expansive welfare so they would have a better life. You might take a more moderate position like this and say, there is a way of intervening in nature that would seem straightforwardly to be good for the animal. If we could give them a lifespan that's commensurate to a human lifespan, say to a dog, live 70 years or 80 years, they could go on a lot longer doing what they enjoy. So that's a kind of intervention in nature that it seems less controversial. I think more people would be likely to agree with that. But it is an intervention, not of the same magnitude.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I can foresee spawning a whole bunch of Macropolis cases for the excessive longevity of rabbits. Sorry, that's a side note.
No, that's not a side note. So Bernard Williams thinks the Macropolis case. He argues when it comes to whether death is a harm for human beings. If we lived really, really long, we would actually run out of valuable life projects. We would just get bored with life. We couldn't just do the same thing over and over. We would exhaust our possibilities, and so we'd want to die. Death would be good for us. Now, something I did talk about in my dissertation was the case of animals, and I noticed later that Coast Guard briefly talks about this too. For example, a pig. Pigs like to play with straw, as Coast Guard notes. And it seems like they never get tired of it. It seems like, the pig could probably do that for eternity and enjoy it just as much each time. So there's a sense in which, if Williams is right about humans, it's worse to kill an animal because they'll always enjoy what they enjoy. They could go on for eternity, but actually, at least in our case, we'll grow weary of the world and want to die.
I have to say, in full disclosure, with the Williams argument in the Macropolis case, and they're similar. Richard Taylor makes a similar kind of argument, and there are others out there. To me, their arguments always strike me as a paucity of imagination.
Right.
That I am very skeptical of their belief that boredom would pose the kind of threat that they think it does. And maybe that's a way of saying, I think we're closer to the pigs with the straw than they might realize.
Yeah, Nussbaum says that about Williams when she talks about it. She says he seems to be being a bit too romantic and kind of existentialist in that kind of claim.
That's interesting, though.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to say it, we've gone on long, but I feel like we should give Gretchen and Jack any final thoughts or... All right, then I think we should move to thanking Ben very much for a very lively, interesting, informative discussion. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Had fun. Thanks for having me.
The music for Caped Conversations is used courtesy of Michael Honish. Special recognition is also due to executive producer Jack Elmore and content producer Gretchen Saar. The views expressed on the program reflect the respective opinions of the hosts and guests only and should not be taken to reflect the official views of any other persons or entities.